Christina has sent me a message.
All right, we are live.
Good evening, everybody. Today is June 15th, 2020. It is approximately 7:03 p.m. We're a couple of minutes late here. I am Councilman Bob Phillips. I am in the pro tem this evening as our council president. William Lutz is out of the area. And tonight we're going to be led in our invocation and pledge by Councilman Bill Rozelle. And Mr. Rozelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh God, we come together as one body to thank you for the gift of life and for the opportunity to serve the people of this community. Help us to make decisions with character and integrity, to listen with understanding and goodwill. Renew us in the spirit of giving selflessly to others. Bless all those who work together in partnership to make Troy a great place to live, work, and raise a family. All these things we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, sir. Mrs. Knight, will you now call the roll, please?
Mr. Swayze.
Here.
Mr. Rozelle.
Here.
Mr. Phillips.
Here.
Mr. Sievert.
Present.
Mrs. Sneed.
Here.
Mr. Twilliger.
Here.
Mr. Schilling.
Here.
Mr. Allen.
Here.
Mr. Twist.
Here.
All members are present.
Thank you. Tonight we have a public hearing on Ordinance 31-2020. Do we have any comments or anything on this?
I need
Mrs.
to
Knight?
read the title.
If you would, please. Sorry.
Yes. An ordinance changing the zoning of parcel numbers D08026290 and D08026300 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of R6 to OC1 Office Commercial District, and this is located at 6 North Madison Street. And no, I did not receive any comments.
Are we? We're not having any type of comment, pro or con, on the air. Is that correct? Okay. Any council people have any comment on this? Hearing none, and not the city has not received any pro or con written information. I'm declaring the public hearing is closed. And Mrs. Knight, would you please read a summary of the minutes of the June 1 meeting?
Minutes of Council, June 1, 2020. There was a public hearing held on ordinance number 028-2020, a rezoning. Committee reports. Building and Utilities Committee recommended that bidding be authorized for the replacement of the east side roof of the Hobart Arena. Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing demolition of 2 properties, 212 South Mulberry, 110 East Canal, owned by the city. Committee recommended a professional services agreement for the design of the wastewater treatment plant blower replacement project. Community and Economic Development Committee recommended legislation be prepared for the Community Development Block Grant Fund application and also a CDBG application for a critical infrastructure project.
Thank you. We have a motion on the minutes.
Wasn't
I'm sorry.
done.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you would. I don't like having my back to you, so I can't see what you're doing.
But
Sorry. Sorry.
Hey, we're live.
Yeah.
Community Partnerships Committee recommended an amended lease between the city and the Community Improvement Corporation regarding Lincoln Center. Streets and Sidewalks Committee recommended approval of the vacation of an alley. Resolution number R34-2020, replace roof at Hobart Arena, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R35-2020, demolition of 2 city-owned structures, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R36-2020, design services for wastewater plant blower replacement project, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R37-2020, PY 2020 CDBG application, first reading and adopted. Resolution number R38, 2020, an application for CDBG funds for a critical infrastructure project, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 030, 2020, declaring a property as surplus, was given seventh reading and was adopted. Ordinance number 028, 2020, a rezoning on Kirk Lane, was given second reading. Ordinance number 029, 2020, vacating an alley, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 030, 2020, amending a lease regarding Lincoln Center, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 031, 2020, a rezoning, was given first reading. Following various comments, council adjourned at 7:50 p.m.
Thank you. Now you're done.
I could be.
Thank you very much. We have some committee reports tonight.
We need to approve them.
I'm sorry.
You guys accept them?
Now what is your pleasure on the minutes, gentlemen or ladies?
Move to
accept.
approve.
Second.
All right, we've got Mr. Terwilliger with the motion to approve, and I think Mr. Rozell for the second. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Mrs. Knight, please.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Siebert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Now we can move into committee reports. And the first one we have is the Community and Economic Development Committee. And this is Mrs. Snead.
thank you, Mr. Phillips. The Community and Economic Development Committee met remotely on June 8th to review the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission that parcel number D08057920, which is 430 Kirk Lane, be rezoned from R4 Single Family Residential District to OC1 Office Commercial District. This committee supports the recommendation of the Troy Planning Commission regarding this proposed rezoning and recommends that council adopt ordinance number 028, 2020. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Rozell, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Any comments on that report? Thank you. We'll move along to the Community Partnerships Committee, and this is chaired by Councilman Rozell. Mr. Rozell.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. This committee met on June 8th remotely to consider a request of the Pink Ribbon Girls that require an agreement associated with the use of public property for the sale, consumption of alcohol beverages on July 3rd, 2020, and includes the notwithstanding wording. It is a recommendation of this committee the legislation be prepared to authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an agreement with Pink Ribbon Girls related to an event on public property on July 3rd, 2020, and that the legislation include the standard notwithstanding legislation for such events. Based on the stated time frame for the Pink Ribbon Girls to confirm the event, committee supports emergency legislation. We know that the event being held is subject to the organization obtaining a temporary liquor permit. Respectfully submitted, Mr. Zach Allen, Mr. John Swazer, and myself, William Rozell, as chairman.
Thank you. Any comments from council on that report? Hearing none, moving along, we have a committee report with the Finance Committee and Mr. Schwazer as chairman.
Yes, I believe we have two tonight. This committee met remotely on June 8th regarding refinancing two bond issues that would result in the city saving approximately $1.1 million in interest and principal over the next 20 years in the general, water, and sewer funds. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the refinancing of the two bond issues. In that the issuance and sale of the new bonds is very time sensitive, the committee supports emergency legislation. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Siebert, and myself as chair.
Any comments from council on this report? Please continue, Mr. Schwazer.
Yes, sir. This committee met remotely on June 8th regarding being able to submit applications for possible funding to reimburse the city for qualifying due to the COVID-19 pandemic from the funding provided by the CARES Act. A requirement of submitting for reimbursement is enacting a resolution establishing the protocols provided for by the Act. Enacting a resolution is not a guarantee of receiving funds, but without the resolution, the city cannot participate in any funding related to the CARES Act. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared establishing protocols for the city related to the CARES Act based on the guidelines provided. This committee supports emergency legislation so that the city can submit the required resolution without delay. And this is again submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Any comments from council on this matter? Hearing none, we'll proceed on with the Recreation and Parks Committee, and this is Councilman Schilling. Mr. Schilling?
Okay, thank you. This committee met remotely on June 8th to review the recommendation of the Board of Park Commissioners that council adopt the policy guidelines to approve reapproval of declaring as surplus City Board of Park Commissioners property. The policy was adopted by the Park Board on June 2nd. It is a recommendation of this committee that the council adopt the attached policy guidelines. This would not be by a legislative action, but by a motion, second, and roll call vote to adopt policy guidelines, approval of declaring as surplus City Board of Park Commissioners property. This is respectfully submitted by Mr. Bobby Phillips, Mr. Twilliger, and myself as chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Is that the motion that you are making?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to adopt the policy guidelines and reapproving the declaring as surplus City Board of Park Commissioner property.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Schweizer, thank you. Mrs. Knight, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Motion is adopted.
Thank you. We'll be moving into the Streets and Sidewalks Committee, and I have two reports tonight. The first one is an ODOT LPA project agreement. And on June 8th, this committee met remotely to consider an LPA agreement with ODOT related to receiving federal funding for a new traffic signal at West Main Street and Kings Chapel Drive. The funding for the signal project is approximately $421,513. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to submit an application to the Ohio Department of Transportation for the ODOT safety funds, enter into the standard LPA agreement with ODOT, and to execute any later documents that may be required. Based on timing for these projects, and as this is a ODOT format, committee supports emergency legislation, and this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair. Are there any comments from council on this matter?
I have my middle initial is A, not D. I don't know if that makes a difference in the,
Sorry.
okay.
We'll
That's
note
it.
that. Thank you.
so much.
Any other comments from any of the council folks? Second item with the Streets and Sidewalks Committee. It's an ODOT grant for application for signal timing analysis. On June 8th, the committee met remotely to review information regarding an ODOT grant program that would totally fund a signal timing analysis along an area of South Market Street. It is the recommendation of the committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to submit an application to the Ohio Department of Transportation to utilize ODOT funding for a signal timing analysis along South Market Street from Simpson Street to Water Street, and to execute any later documents that may be required. Based on timing for applications, and as this is an ODOT format, committee supports emergency legislation, and this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Schilling, Mrs. Snee, and myself as chair. Any comments from council on that item? Okay, hearing none, we'll move into resolutions. And Mrs. Knight, would you please read R39 2020, please?
Resolution number R39 2020. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio to submit an application and enter into an agreement with the Ohio Department of of Transportation regarding funding for a South Market Street signal timing analysis project and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
How does council wish to proceed on this matter?
Move to suspend.
Second.
I'm sorry, who was this? Who was the motion? Mr. Sievert, and the second,
I think I got that one.
Mr. Schilling?
Yep.
Got it. Thank you. Yes, please.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes. Moving along.
Move to adopt.
Thank you, Mr. Schweizer.
Second.
Mr. Rozell. Thank you. Mrs. Knight?
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, would you please read R40 2020, please?
Resolution number R40 2020, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to submit an application for funding and enter into an LPA agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation associated with a new traffic signal and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
Thank you. Council, how do you wish to proceed?
Move to suspend.
Mr.
Second.
Schultz? I think that was Mr. Sievert. And Mrs. Knight, please.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Mr. Twist, he's muted.
Frozen.
He's
He's
muted.
frozen.
Yeah.
We will stand by just a moment.
Mr. Twist, oh, he froze up.
Yep, we did.
Say we got.
Must be a practice.
Please hold comments.
Okay, he's trying again. Somebody's waiting.
Okay, do we need to confirm where we are?
Yeah.
Okay, we're doing roll call for suspension on resolution number R40. Mr. Twist,
There it is. Your video's not working, sir.
Mr. Swazer,
There.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
yes,
Before we proceed any further, I want to clarify that in case someone does drop out or freeze or something like this, we must stop all communication and proceedings until we can get that person back live on screen. So please respect that. So moving along with the suspension has been completed and the motion on the resolution, please.
Move to
Move to
adopt.
Second.
Mr. Sievert, and the second was, I didn't catch the second, please.
Second.
Mr. Terwilliger, thank you. Mrs. Knight?
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Twilliger.
yes,
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you. Mrs. Knight, can we proceed on to Resolution R41, 2020?
Resolution number R41, 2020. Resolution establishing protocols for the city of Troy related to the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economy Security Act, 116 Public Law 136, and the CARES Act, and declaring an emergency. This is a resolution that we must file to be considered to receive any funding. First reading.
Thank you. Council, how do you wish to proceed on this matter?
Move to suspend.
So Mr.
Second.
Schwager, and the second is from Mr. Sievert. Thank you. Mrs. Knight?
Mr. Allen,
yes,
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snead,
yes,
Mr. Twilliger,
yes,
Mr. Schilling.
yes,
Move to adopt.
Mr.
Second.
Schwager, and a second by Mr. Rozell. Thank you.
Mr. Twist just dropped. Mr. Twist, are you still there? Well, he lit up. He's trying to talk. No, you're coming in and out. I'm not sure where you're at.
Okay,
He's coming
Mr.
back.
Rozell, excuse me, Mr. Twist has dropped off, so we are in a permanent hold here until we get him back.
Permanent. He's back on. Not really. You're not coming in well at all, Mr. Twist. Where's he gonna call it? He's trying again. Twist bugs.
All right.
Well, you're still on two different things. So, all right, now you're there. Where are you? There you are, but it's not a good picture. There you go.
There we go. Sorry.
Can you hang up your phone?
I'm gonna
Yeah, I did.
I'm going to remove your other one. Nope, that wasn't
It should be off.
Okay, you should be fine.
Much
Yeah.
clearer.
All right, congratulations. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay,
This is roll call for the adoption of
There
R
we go.
42, 2020, or I'm sorry, 41, the CARES Act.
CARES Act, yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Caesar,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
You're muted, Todd.
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Excellent. Moving right along to R 42, 2020.
Resolution number R 42, 2020, resolution urging Governor DeWine and the Ohio Department of Health for a fully open economy and declaring an emergency. First reading.
Move to suspend.
That was Mr. Rozell and Mr. Schweizer. Mrs. Knight?
Mr. Phillips.
Mr.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
I was under the understanding from our meeting of last week that we were going to have some time to discuss this resolution. Is that somewhere in the schedule?
After we get the motions, we'll discuss before the vote's taken.
That is fine. Thank you so much.
So let's go ahead with the suspension roll call.
Okay. Mr. Swayzer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Sneed,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
Sorry, Jeff, you wanted to talk?
No.
Yes, I did.
Get the motion on.
Get the motion and the second, and then we will have discussion on it.
Okay.
All right.
That
motion's
was
on the-
Mr. Schweizer and Mr. Twists for the second, I believe. Okay. Mr. Schilling, you have the floor.
Thank you. First of all, I assumed everybody has read this thing. I think the language is very convoluted and very difficult, and it is hard to understand. I think there are things in this resolution that are not evidenced by fact. In other words, I can't say for certain that what we are whereasing is true. They talk about constitutional rights that, again, are not self-evident in the Constitution. I think overall this resolution could be boiled down into about maybe 5 sections. I don't know. Does anybody know where this resolution came from?
Mr. Chitterington,
Sure. This
Can I
was borrowed from primarily from the city of Mason did a resolution. And so this took the language from it and took out certain tourism related whereases. It was much longer with the city of Mason.
I think there's maybe 4 or 5 points that we ought to consider in this resolution. Number one, I think we should, whereas Governor DeWine had declared an emergency, a state of emergency back in March, we can recognize the fact that Governor DeWine and the Department of Health and the residents of Ohio have taken some actions to help flatten the curve. I think that is okay. We can recognize the fact that individuals and families and businesses have suffered some losses as a result of this, the restrictions imposed, both social and economic. And again, we want to essentially say that we have learned some things from this, and we are ready to move on. But again, when you start all these things that they talk about is just I say again, the language is just absolutely incomprehensible for most people. And I don't think that we as a council want to be responsible for some statements that, as I say again, some people can't understand. And secondly, some of these statements are not true. As an example, in the third whereas, let's see, the Ohioans have flattened the curve. Healthcare system has not been overwhelmed, and the healthcare system is equipped with sufficient number of ventilators and PE to handle a surge in COVID-19 if it were to occur. We don't know that as to be true. Somewhere, we don't know. We haven't, because we haven't been through the second wave on this. We don't know how significant it's going to be. We don't know whether or not our hospitals are going to be overwhelmed or not. I mean, this is a supposition, and it is not a proven fact.
Mr. Phillips?
Hold on just a moment. Mr. Schilling, are you done, or do you have further?
I can take a rest.
Okay. Mrs. Sneed, please.
I just wonder if there's a specific amendment that Mr. Schilling is proposing. Are there specific removals or additions?
Got it. Thank you. Mr. Schilling?
I have rewritten this thing. I have not sent it out. Again, I think it would be best to go back, put this into some committee and review this thing and talk about amendments at the committee level, and then come back to council with a resolution that would be acceptable. But again, you have to look at Governor DeWine has been in office, some sort of elective office, for almost 50 years. I am certain that he is well aware that there's a tremendous economic impact on everybody in the state of Ohio. But his primary concern, which I applaud him for, is to first look out for the health and welfare of all Ohioans. And it's a fine line, to protect Ohio's health and also protect Ohio's economy. And so I think we can do a better job of getting those two facts across than what has been written here. And then the second thing we have to ask is that if we pass a resolution, is it going to make a difference? I mean, what are we going to gain by passing this resolution? I don't think Governor DeWine is going to read this resolution and say, "Oh, what a great idea. I think I'll open up the economy in the state of Ohio." It's under consideration, and I believe they're working as hard as they can and as cautiously as they can to get this done. And then the other question you have to ask yourself, what in Miami County, what in Troy, Ohio is not open?
Okay.
What business can you tell me that's not open in the city of Troy?
Mr. Titherington, can you address that?
Some respect or another.
Mr. Rozell, did you have a question?
Yeah, I would like Patrick to address that comment by Jeff.
Do you know of any such businesses or anything?
So I think as far as businesses not being open at all, I don't know that is the case, but I would refer you back to the title of the resolution that talks about encourages a wholly open economy. I can say that restaurants are open, but there are 10-person limits per table. They have to be spaced out such that they cannot have maximum occupancy. I can tell you that while restaurants and bars have been open partially, tattoo parlors, for example, were opened later than that. Receptions are limited to 300. The day that it was they were reopened, there was no dancing. 2 days later, they decided to allow dancing. Playgrounds, there was some confusion. Were they open or were they not open? Contact sports, not open, but training is okay. Concerts, we've worked very closely with our county health district to make sure that we could safely put on concerts on June 26th, as well as June 3rd and June 4th. There's no specific guidance on that. There was nothing given to tell us at the state level. Our pool is open almost 3 weeks later than it normally would. It's open at a capacity that was basically negotiated between us and the county health district. Proms, were they open? Weren't they open? Many proms were closed. And then when receptions opened, I guess they could have been open, but probably not, because there was no dancing and then there was dancing. Graduation parties, another one that is not, I guess, allowed, because the general limit is still 10 persons with social distancing as an exception, not a rule. But then free speech, protests, marches, discussions, if you will, have no limit whatsoever. Very little consistency, very confusing. Many businesses as well as residents don't know what is wholly open and what is not wholly open. Education system still does not know what they're doing in the fall, when in fact they were supposed to have some guidance a week ago Friday, or at least sometime last week, and still have not received any kind of notification. So that is why the title of the resolution 42 is written the way it is.
Thank you. From a personal perspective, and speaking to a business owner today, she has contacted the governor's office in her business that is partially open, and encouraging him and requesting for further guidelines about what to do in certain circumstances that she outlined. And she's not received any communication or guidance on that. And as to Mr. Titterington's point, the title of the wholly open, which many, well, I don't know what the numbers are, but a good preponderance of our population are encouraging things to be opened and not have the limitation of a quarantined, healthy society. So this is a non-binding resolution urging the governor and his representatives to come around a lot quicker and to wholly open things. And that's solely what this is. And
I would encourage, the governor to do that prudently. And again, I think we can accomplish that resolution. But again, I think that what is presented before us is almost unreadable.
Thank you.
I would like to move this back to committee.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Mr. Seaver?
I think the important thing to look at is not the dicta contained in the whereas clauses, but in the actual meat of the resolution, which are the, I believe, 7 points. When you read those, it becomes very clear what the intent, at least of the body, is to simply set forth that we're going to use the least restrictive measure to control this, and we would ask that the governor open up the communities and the businesses utilizing that standard of review, and that we move forward. From my perspective, I'm sure Grant's read this. I know he's muted right now, but I know I saw an email from Grant talking about that at one point in time. So if you read the sections 1 through 8, which is really what we're resolving, I personally don't have any problems with it.
Okay, as an example, Mr. Sievert, in section 4, the Governor DeWine and the Ohio Department of Health protect and promote individuals' rights and personal responsibilities to lawfully choose. If I'm not mistaken, the health department has the ability to supersede individual rights. In other words, that is when it comes to health. And that's why we have to have our children inoculated. There's very few exceptions that essentially say that we cannot inoculate our children. That is why when when someone contracts a sexually transmitted disease, it has to be reported to the Board of Health. And there's other types of examples.
Yeah, but that's not what
We
that
don't have
says, Jeff.
individual rights when it comes to public health.
What it says is that they will manage their own risk and safety standards for the best practice for themselves and their families.
Promote individual rights and personal responsibilities. Again, promoting individual rights and public health. That is.
Yeah, but you can't stop there. You got to read the whole sentence.
Well, again, you're talking about individual rights to personally choose. Again, you don't have a personal choice to inoculate your child. It's required.
That's not.
In most.
Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips. And
Mrs. Snee, go ahead.
and unless there is a motion on the floor that we're moving this back to committee, I'd like to call the question.
There's not hang on, time. Hey, hold on a second, Mr. Schilling. There is a motion and a second on this item. If you want to make a motion later, Mr. Schilling, you may, but this is for discussion at this point for the motion and the second on this item.
Mr. Phil.
Yes.
She just called the question. You better double check with Grant. Once you call the question, I think it's
All discussion. Okay, Mr. Kerber, can you weigh in on calling the question at this moment and whether that leads directly to the vote?
He's muted.
You are muted, Mr.
Grant, you're muted.
You're muted.
Please let the chairman address, please.
There you go.
All right.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Essentially, it's my understanding that the Council Rule 10 allows for a motion and a vote on to call the question. I know Mrs. Snee went ahead and made the motion to call the question. I would have see if there's a second, and then assuming that there is a second, you'd have a vote on calling the question.
Mr. Kerber, I don't believe when you call the question, there's a second and a motion on it. I think that's an automatic, isn't it?
Well, the council rules refer to that as a motion.
Correct.
And that will supersede the motion on this item at the moment
It can be acted upon, correct?
independently.
Correct.
Okay.
So we need to-
All right.
On whether to
Mrs.
call the question.
I'm sorry.
Second.
Mrs. Snee, would you
Work.
because she called.
stand by one? Can Mrs. Snee, would you please restate your motion, please, for clarity?
My only comment was unless there is a motion, which I don't think I heard, to move this to committee, then I move to call the question.
Okay, then I would like to make the motion to call this, to send it back to committee. I said that twice.
But I didn't hear a second on that.
We have to act on Mrs. Snee's motion first.
Thank you. Do I have a second to Mrs. Snee?
Second.
That was
Mr. Roselle.
Mr. Roselle, I believe. Thank you. Mrs. Knight, Mrs. Knight, would you please call the roll?
And this is on the adoption.
No,
I'm
this is
sorry.
on
Oh.
This-
calling the
Sorry,
This is
sorry,
on
sorry.
calling the
Call
question.
question. Mr. Roselle,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Mr. Twist?
Mr. Twist,
Sorry. Yes. Yes.
thank you, Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
So motion is approved to call the question.
So
Okay,
now-
so Mr. Kerber, then this goes directly to the vote on the matter. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's my understanding there's already a motion and a second, so it's appropriate for the roll call.
Gotcha. Thank you, sir. Mrs. Knight, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
I cannot support this as written, no.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Roselle.
Yes.
Motion
Resolution is
is
adopted.
adopted. Thank you. We're moving into ordinances. Ordinance 028-2020. Mrs. Knight, would you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 028-2020, an ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08057-920 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of R4 Single Family Residential District to OC1 Office Commercial District. This is located at 4430 Kirk Lane, has been recommended for approval by the Planning Commission. This will be the third reading.
Folks, we've had a public hearing on this. This is the third reading. What is your pleasure with this item?
Move to adopt.
Second.
Mrs. Snee got the motion and Mr. Twist got the second. Mrs. Knight?
Mr. Sievert.
Mr. Sievert?
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Moving along to ordinance 31-2020. We had the first reading 2 weeks ago and we had our public hearing tonight. Mrs. Knight, would you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 031-2020. An ordinance changing the zoning of parcel numbers D08026-290 and D08026-300 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of R6 two-family residential district to OC1 office commercial district. This is the address of 6 North Madison Street, has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission, had a public hearing this evening and will be on the next committee agenda.
Thank you. Okay. Moving along to ordinance 32-2020. Mrs. Knight, would you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 032-2020. That's providing for the issuance and sale of bonds in the maximum aggregate principal amount of $14 million for the purpose of paying the cost of refunding bonds previously issued by the city for the purpose of paying the cost of A, improving the 1 municipal sanitary sewer system, including by lining existing sanitary sewer lines and manholes, together with all incidental work and related appurtenances thereto, and 2, municipal water system, including the installation of new water distribution lines and the replacement of existing water distribution lines, together with all incidental work related appurtenances thereto, and B, improving the riverfront development project, including Hobart Arena and Treasure Island Park, by constructing, rehabilitating, refurbishing, and equipping the same, together with all incidental work and related appurtenances thereto, and declaring an emergency. First reading.
Okay. What is your pleasure with this item?
Move to suspend.
Mr. Schweizer
Second.
and Mr. Rozell. Thank you. Mrs. Knight?
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Mr. Schweizer
Second.
and Mrs. Snee. Thank you. Mrs. Knight?
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Allen.
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you. Moving along to ordinance 33-2020, the notwithstanding agreement. Mrs. Knight?
Ordinance number 033-2020. Ordinance authorizing the use of public areas for a Pink Ribbon Girls event, notwithstanding conflicting provisions of the Troy codified ordinances, and further approving the use of an area for the sale of beer subject to the issuance of proper permits by the state of Ohio and procurement of liquor liability insurance, and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the city of Troy, Ohio to enter into an agreement with Pink Ribbon Girls, Inc., therefore, and declaring an emergency. This event would be held on July 3rd, 2020. First reading.
Thank you. Council,
Move
Move to suspend.
Mr. Schilling got that one. And the second, please.
Second.
Mr. Rozell, thank you. Mrs. Knight?
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
yes,
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Terwilliger.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Mr.
Second.
Schwager and Mrs. Snee, thank you. Mrs. Knight?
Mr. Allen,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
no,
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
yes,
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Thank you. Moving into our last ordinance of the evening of 034-2020, rezoning 1375 South Union. Mrs. Knight, please.
Ordinance number 034-2020, an ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08106648 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classification of I2, General Industrial District, to the city zoning of M3, General Industrial District. This is the first reading. There will be a public hearing at the next council meeting, recommended by the Troy Planning Commission.
Thank you. That concludes the business section of our meeting this evening. Any communications? Madam Mayor, do you have anything for us this evening?
Just that we received over 100 applications for the Human Relations Commission last week, and we are narrowing those selections down, and I will start calling those people tomorrow to make sure if they are still interested. And so we're moving forward. It will eventually come to council for their approval of those designations.
Thank you. Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titterington.
Thank you, Mr. President. A couple of announcements. First of all, July 3rd is a holiday. So the city building will be closed. However, trash and recycling will be on schedule. We do have several concerts, as I mentioned earlier. We plan on a concert on June 26th at Treasure Island, beginning at 7:30. We also have our concert, our 4th of July concert on, you guessed it, July 4th at Treasure Island. That will begin at 8 o'clock and will be followed by the fireworks, weather permitting, of course. Also, in the next couple of days, you will see a press release. So the Ohio EPA has issued some relief, actually total relief, on suspension of shutoffs for water and sewer utilities. That will be effective July 10th. In anticipation of that, we will be sending out a press release to start a program whereby anyone with delinquent bills, anyone being residents, residential landlords, or small businesses, which are 50 employees or less, who have delinquencies that have accumulated up to July 1st, or I guess July 10th, technically. If they come in and they make an appointment to work out payment with the help of the Emergency Relief Fund through the Troy Foundation, we will have the ability to pay off up to 80% of the delinquent bill. And then the customer would be responsible for paying the other 20%, or in the case of extreme circumstances, making a payment plan to get on a schedule to pay that off. That is forthcoming. We're still waiting on some final details, but we anticipate that we should have those tomorrow at the latest on Wednesday. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Director of Law, Mr. Kerber, do you have anything this evening?
You can just shake your head.
No, I don't. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And our auditor is not with us this evening, so I expect he would have nothing. I have one item, and this comes from Councilman Sievert, and he's asking how citizens are to make comments regarding the reverse angle parking. And Mr. Titterington has advised that the city is accepting communications by calls or email, and will have a form on the city's website soon.
It's already there.
It is there, okay, for submitting comments. And it is important, as Mr. Sievert notes here, for all our citizens to participate in that survey and have your voices heard. And apparently Mr. Titterington is in concurrence with that comment. So thank you, Mr. Sievert, for the question.
And enthusiasm.
I'm sorry?
Only after.
Comment only after you've tried that. Any council folks have any comments this evening?
Yes.
Mr. Rozelle.
I've got a couple from citizens. One deals with the traffic light on the westbound 41 to the southbound ramp of 75. A couple people are saying that the turn signal, the arrow that had been there previously to the pandemic, is either discontinued or not functioning. There's no turn thing. They would like that checked out. A couple other people asked if there was a problem with Rumpke today in the north end. Some people at least got missed if there wasn't.
So 2 questions, 2 answers. First of all, the stoplight is the responsibility of ODOT. We will reach out to them tomorrow.
Okay.
Yes, there was an issue. I just got notification about the fact that apparently a Rumpke truck broke down. And so residents in that area should just leave their recycling out overnight, and they will be back to pick it up.
And one last one. It also deals with, I think we got an email from Ms. Shannon about noisy cars in her neighborhood. There's a couple other neighborhoods that are requesting loud, noisy cars and the speed of them going through up and down. So I guess they're just requesting that police be aware of that and do what they can do.
We will do that.
That's it, sir. Thank you.
Anyone else? No other communications from citizens or anything this evening. Thank you. All right, having no more business and other items, then our council meeting of June 15 is adjourned. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.